Theodora Hadley had spent 31 years being overlooked, and she had grown so accustomed to it that when Nathan Bailey walked into the dusty general store on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883 and asked for her by name, she assumed he had the wrong woman. The town of Calla Creek, Texas, sat like a blister on the flat skin of the plains, swollen and persistent, the kind of place that people passed through rather than arrived at. It had a single main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without quarreling, a saloon that smelled of sawdust and whiskey and old ambitions, a church whose bell had not rung in 2 years because nobody had bothered to replace the rope, and a general store owned by Elias Drummond, who was 64 years old, half-deaf, and fond of reminding everyone that he had been the first man to nail a plank into this particular piece of earth. Theodora worked for Elias Drummond. She had worked for him for 6 years, since she was 25 and her mother had died and left her with nothing but a rented room above the feed store and the clothes on her back. She stocked shelves and kept the ledger and measured out flour and sugar and dried beans into brown paper bags, and she did it quietly and efficiently, and most of the customers did not know her name even after years of her handing them their change. She was not remarkable in the way that drew eyes. She was of medium height and lean in the way that came from working too hard and eating too little. With dark brown hair she kept pinned back so tightly it pulled at the skin near her temples. Her eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, a kind of muted greenish-brown that people never remarked upon. Her hands were capable and a little rough. Her voice was low and steady. She had a habit of pressing her lips together when she was thinking hard, and a habit of going very still when she was upset, like a rabbit in tall grass. She had not been chosen for anything, not once, in 31 years. She had not been chosen for the church choir at 14 because her voice was too quiet. She had not been chosen by Henry Alcott at 18, who had courted her for 3 weeks and then married Catherine Pryor instead without explanation. She had not been chosen by her father, who had ridden away when she was 9 and never come back. She had not been chosen by the schoolmaster position in Abilene, which had gone to a man with half her qualifications. She had not been chosen by anything in Calla Creek, either, not the town council to advise on the new water well, not the church committee for the harvest supper, not the small circle of women who gathered on Thursday afternoons to exchange patterns and gossip. She was simply there, present and unremarked upon, like the water barrel outside the general store or the weather vane on the feed barn. That was the kind of woman she was on the Tuesday morning Nathan Bailey came in. She was behind the counter, writing in the ledger, when she heard the door open and the familiar complaint of the wooden floor beneath boots. She did not look up immediately. The morning light was good and she was tallying a column of figures that refused to cooperate. "I am looking for a woman named Theodora Hadley," the voice said. She looked up then. He was tall, which was the first thing she noticed, because he filled the doorway in a way that blocked the morning light and made her squint. He was perhaps 34 or 35, with a lean, sun-weathered face and dark eyes that were doing a careful inventory of the room the way a man does when he has learned that knowing where everything is can keep him alive. He wore a plain gray shirt and dark trousers and a brown leather vest that had seen considerable use, and a hat that had been rained on too many times and still held its shape through stubbornness alone. He was not carrying a gun on his hip, which was unusual, but she noticed the rifle in the scabbard on the horse tied outside the door. He was not handsome in the obvious, theatrical way of men who know they are handsome. He was handsome in the quieter, more durable way of men who have been shaped by weather and work and years, the kind of face that grew more interesting the longer you looked at it. "I am Theodora Hadley," she said, because there was no point in pretending she wasn't. Something in his expression shifted, not quite relief but adjacent to it. He crossed the store, removed his hat with one hand and extended the other. "Nathan Bailey," he said, "I have come about the advertisement." She shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief. "I don't know what advertisement you mean," she said honestly. He blinked. Then he reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded piece of newsprint, worn soft at the creases from being handled. He set it on the counter between them, and she leaned forward and read it. It was from the Calla Creek Gazette, 3 months old, placed in the column she had never paid much attention to, the one that ran between the announcements for livestock auctions and the notices for land claims. It read, "Capable woman sought. Must be hardy and honest, able to manage a household and willing to relocate to the hill country, 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. Good wages offered. Steady work. References required. Inquire for N. Bailey, General Delivery, San Antonio Post." She stared at it. "I did not place this advertisement," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Your name is on the letter I received." She turned the newsprint over. On the back he had tucked a folded letter written in handwriting she recognized immediately because she had seen it every day for 6 years on the bills of sale and the accounts ledger. Elias Drummond had answered the advertisement on her behalf. She stood very still for a long moment. She could hear the old clock on the shelf ticking. Outside, a horse shifted its weight and blew through its nose. "He did not tell me," she said. "No," Nathan Bailey said. "I gathered that from your face." She set the letter down. "I am going to speak to Mr. Drummond," she said, with great, careful control, and she walked into the back room where Elias Drummond was, as she had suspected, pretending to sort a box of nails with considerable absorption. "You answered an advertisement for me," she said. Elias set down a nail and turned around slowly, with the dignity of a man who knows he is caught but intends to be dignified about it. He was a round-shouldered, white-haired man with an impressive mustache and small, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles that he refused to admit he needed. "I did," he said, "without asking me. You would have said no." "Yes," she agreed, "I would have." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Theodora, I am selling the store. I should have told you sooner, and I am sorry for that. My son in Dallas wants me to come and help with his business, and I am 64 years old and my knees hurt, and I want to sit somewhere soft for the remainder of my days." He looked at her directly, which he did not always do. "I wrote to that Bailey man because he wrote to the Gazette asking if they knew of anyone honest and hardworking, and one of the things I am most certain of in this life is that you are both of those things. I thought if I asked you first you'd refuse out of stubbornness, and then be stuck here with nothing when I close in May." She pressed her lips together. May was 6 weeks away. "You should have asked me," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I should have, I'm sorry, but will you go out there and at least talk to the man?" She stood in the doorway between the back room and the store, and she looked at Nathan Bailey, who had not sat down or touched anything, but stood in the middle of the store with his hat in his hands, waiting with the patient stillness of a man who spent a great deal of time waiting on things larger and slower than himself, on weather and land and cattle and seasons. She went back out. "What is the position?" she said. "Exactly." He told her directly and without embellishment, which she appreciated. He had a ranch called the Split Rock, 63 miles northwest of San Antonio, carrying cattle and some sheep. He had built the house himself 8 years ago with 2 other men. His cook and housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez who had been with him since the beginning, had returned to her daughter's family in Mexico the previous fall after her husband died. He needed someone to manage the household, the cooking, the kitchen garden, the accounts of the domestic side of the operation, and the general ordering of things that kept the house running. "How many men on the ranch?" she asked. 4 hands currently," he said. "A man named Coop who has been with me 7 years. Pete Garza, who is Coop's nephew. 2 brothers named Harlan and Dutch who arrived last fall and are competent." "And you," she said. "What are you?" He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "I am the owner," he said. 35 years old, not married, no family nearby." He paused. "And I am told I am not easy to work for, so I want to say that plainly before you make any decision. I expect things done a particular way, and I am not always gracious about it when they aren't." She appreciated that too. Honesty about flaws was rarer than it should be. "What are the wages?" she said. He named a figure that was more than she made at the store, considerably more. She was quiet for a moment. The clock ticked. Dust moved in the beam of light through the window. "I have never managed a ranch household," she said. "You manage this store," he said, with a brief glance around that took in the neat shelves and the tidy counter and the organized ledger. "Mrs. Alvarez will write you letters if you have questions about the kitchen," she offered. "You asked her to help me and you hadn't even met me yet," Theodora said. "I asked her to be available to help whoever I hired," he corrected. "I didn't know who that would be." It was a small distinction, but it mattered to her for a reason she could not immediately name. He was precise. He did not embellish things in his favor, even when it would have been easy. "I will need 2 days to think about it," she said. He nodded. "I am staying at the Calla Creek Hotel. I need to purchase some supplies before I head back, so I have until Friday morning." He bought the supplies she measured out for him, paid exactly what the ledger said without haggling, and left. She stood at the window and watched him walk his horse to the hotel and tie it at the post, and she thought about being 31 years old in a town where nobody knew her name, in a job that was about to dissolve, in a rented room above a feed store. And she thought about her mother who had spent her whole life waiting for something better that never came. And she thought about how the road leading northwest out of Calla Creek caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look briefly like something worth following. She gave him her answer on Wednesday morning. She would come. The look on his face when she said it was not triumph or relief. It was something quieter and more measured, and later, much later, she would understand that it was the look of a man who was more glad than he knew how to say. She spent the remaining weeks in a state of controlled preparation that kept the larger emotions at bay. She packed her belongings, which did not take long because she did not have many. She said goodbye to Elias Drummond with more genuine feeling than she expected, and she accepted the handshake he offered, and then, to both their surprise, she embraced him briefly, because he was old and his knees hurt, and he had done something foolish and well-meaning on her behalf, and she understood both of those things. She wrote a letter to Mrs. Alvarez, whose full name was Rosa Alvarez, asking about the kitchen garden and the pantry organization, and the preferences of the men who would be eating her cooking. Rosa Alvarez wrote back within 10 days, a warm and remarkably detailed letter that outlined everything from where Nathan Bailey kept his coffee to the fact that Pete Garza was allergic to something in cilantro and should not be given it. She did not write to Nathan Bailey before she arrived. She did not know what to say, and she had learned long ago that silence was safer than saying something wrong. He met her at the station in San Antonio on a clear Thursday morning in late May. He had a wagon, a solid roan horse, and a younger man riding alongside who he introduced as Coop, who was sun-browned and narrow-faced and shook her hand with the quick energy of a man who found standing still difficult. "Ma'am," Coop said, "we are real glad you've come. The boss burned the beans 3 weeks running." "I did not burn them," Nathan said without looking up from loading her trunk. "I overcooked them." "The distinction," Coop said to Theodora, "is important to him." She found herself almost smiling. The drive out to the Split Rock took most of the day. The land changed as they went, broadening and rising gently into the hill country, where limestone outcroppings broke through the cedar and live oak, and the air smelled of warm stone and wild grass. She had not seen this part of Texas. It was beautiful in the stark, unhurried way of land that does not require your appreciation to persist. Nathan drove the wagon and Coop rode ahead, and for long stretches nobody spoke, which she found restful rather than uncomfortable. He did not make conversation for the sake of it, and neither did she. When he did speak, pointing out landmarks or telling her briefly about the condition of the road after the spring rains, she answered straightforwardly, and occasionally she asked a question, and he answered it the same way. At noon, they stopped near a creek to water the horses and eat the bread and dried beef she had brought from San Antonio. She sat on a limestone rock and watched a mockingbird argue with the silence, and she thought that the hill country looked like the kind of place where a person could breathe all the way to the bottom of their lungs. "What made you come?" he asked. He was sitting on a rock a few feet away, eating without looking at her. "My options were limited," she said honestly. He glanced at her. "That's not a reason to uproot yourself." "The alternative was staying somewhere that had already decided who I was," she said. "That seemed worse." He was quiet for a moment. "What had they decided?" She thought about it. "That I was background," she said. "Something that was there but didn't particularly need noticing." He looked at her then, the full weight of his attention, which she was beginning to understand was a different thing from most men's attention. Most men looked at you and were really looking at their own idea of you. Nathan Bailey looked at you as though he was actually trying to see. "That seems wrong," he said. "Yes," she said. "It does." They drove the rest of the afternoon and arrived at the Split Rock as the sun was going low, painting the limestone and cedar gold, and she saw the house for the first time. It was solidly built, longer than she expected, with a deep covered porch along the front and a separate kitchen wing at the back that was newer than the rest. The yard was swept dirt, bordered by a fence in need of paint, and there was a kitchen garden behind the house that had been recently turned but not yet planted. There were several outbuildings, including a barn and a bunkhouse, and there were cattle visible in the middle distance, a dark shifting mass against the golden grass. Pete Garza met them in the yard, a compact young man of perhaps 23 with an easy smile and watchful eyes. Harlan and Dutch came from the barn, brothers who were clearly brothers, wide-shouldered and sandy-haired, with the same deliberate way of moving. They were respectful and formal, the way men are when they are trying to make a good impression and are not quite sure how. She was shown the house by Nathan himself. It was functional and clean, the floors swept and the windows clear, though there were corners where order had been let slip without Mrs. Alvarez's attention. The kitchen was large and well-equipped with a good iron stove, and a proper work table and shelves that had room for organization. The bedroom she was given was at the far end of the house from his, with its own small window that looked east over the garden toward a low ridge that turned lavender in the evening light. She stood in that room with her trunk at her feet and the window open and the evening air coming in, and she felt something that it took her a while to identify because she was so unaccustomed to it. She felt like she had arrived somewhere, not just geographically, somewhere. She started work the next morning before sunrise because that was simply how she was. She had the kitchen fire going and coffee made and biscuits in the oven before Nathan came in from the barn, where she had heard him moving while the sky was still dark. He stopped in the kitchen doorway with a look of surprised calculation that he quickly neutralized, but she caught it. "The coffee is strong," she warned. "Good," he said. He sat at the long kitchen table and drank his coffee and looked over a paper covered in notes about a fence line while she put breakfast together. And it was quiet and purposeful, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. And it was, she realized, one of the more comfortable mornings she could remember. The weeks that followed were full and hard, and she was grateful for both. The kitchen garden needed planting, and she planted it, with advice from Rosa Alvarez's letters and her own common sense. The house needed a systematic going over, and she did that too, room by room, getting it ordered in ways that made work easier and daily life more bearable. She learned the preferences of the men, who were respectful and occasionally amusing, and generally left her to her work once they understood she knew what she was doing. Nathan was around the house in the mornings and evenings, and often away for the middle of the day, moving across the ranch on whatever the season required. He was not easy to work for, as he had warned her. He was precise about certain things in ways that could seem arbitrary from the outside, the order of the tools in the barn, the way accounts were kept, the timing of certain tasks. When things were not as he expected, he said so directly, without cruelty but without cushioning either. She appreciated the directness even when it stung, because at least with Nathan Bailey she always knew where she stood. That was rarer than it should have been. What she had not expected was that he would ask her opinion about things. Not just household things, though he did ask about those too. He asked what she thought about the price of cattle in the markets, and whether she thought the south pasture fence should be moved or rebuilt. And when she answered based on what she had read and observed and reasoned, he listened. He did not always agree, but he listened with the same attention he gave everything else, like what she said mattered enough to actually consider. It was disorienting. She kept bracing for the point at which he would stop, when his attention would slide past her to something more interesting, as attention always had. But it did not slide. Coop noticed things, because Coop was the kind of man who noticed everything and found most of it entertaining. One evening about 6 weeks in, when Nathan had ridden out to help Dutch and Harlan with a piece of fencing that had come down in a storm, Coop was sitting on the porch steps repairing a bridle, and Theodora was shelling beans in a bowl on the porch, and the light was coming down long and golden across the cedar. "He talked about you in San Antonio," Coop said, without looking up from the leather. She looked at him. "Pardon. When he came to meet you. We drove in together and he spent about 4 hours telling me not to say anything embarrassing." Coop grinned at the bridle, "which is how I knew." "Knew what?" she said carefully. "That the man was already in trouble," Coop said cheerfully. "He'd read your letter twice through and he was nervous before he went into that store, and Nathan Bailey doesn't get nervous. I've seen him stare down a longhorn in a mood and not blink." He paused. "The letter wasn't even from you, turns out, but by then it didn't matter." She was quiet for a moment, shelling beans with great concentration. "You should not be telling me this," she said. "Probably not," Coop agreed. "But I'm about to tell you something else too." He glanced at her sideways. "He's a good man, not a simple one. He's got grief in him he doesn't talk about and standards he holds himself to that nobody else set for him. But he's good all the way through. I just thought you should know that since you're sizing him up." "I am not sizing him up," she said. "You're sizing him up," Coop said with no particular judgment. "You've been doing it since you arrived. That's fine. A sensible woman should." He tied off the bridle and stood. "Just figured I'd give you some information for the effort." She sat with the bowl of beans in her lap and the long light coming across the cedar and did not say anything, but she thought about it for a long time. The grief Coop had mentioned surfaced the following week, not dramatically, but in the quiet way things surface when you are paying attention. She found Nathan in the barn on a Saturday evening when she had come to tell him supper was ready, and he was standing at one of the stalls with his hand on the nose of the old bay mare that was kept in the third stall and never seemed to be used for work. The mare was old, genuinely old, with a white muzzle and patient eyes, and Nathan was standing with his forehead against her forehead in the particular way of a person who needs to touch something steady. She stopped in the barn door and he heard her and straightened, and she could see that he had composed himself very quickly. The way a man does when composing himself is a well-practiced skill. "Supper," she said, as though she had seen nothing. "Coming," he said. She started to go and then turned back. "What is her name?" He looked at her, reassessing. "Grace," he said. "She belonged to my wife." She kept her expression level. "I did not know you had been married." "She died," he said. 7 years ago. The influenza, the winter of 1876. He said it with the flat steadiness of a man who has said it many times and has learned to say it without breaking. "Grace is all I have left that was hers." "She must have been a good woman," Theodora said, "to have had a horse that good." She nodded at the mare. "She's still calm, still trusts people. That's what a kind owner makes." He looked at the mare and then at her, and something in his face opened slightly, just slightly, in the way of a man who is surprised by something he did not expect to be moved by. "Yes," he said, "she was." She walked back to the house and set the biscuits in a cloth to stay warm and told herself firmly that she was an employee and a practical woman, and that pity was not the same thing as love, and neither was admiration, and neither was the strange, warm recognition of finding someone whose silences felt like her own. But she thought about his wife, the unknown woman who had ridden a horse named Grace and married Nathan Bailey and died in the winter of 1876, and she felt a complicated sorrow for all of them. The woman who was gone, the man who had carried it for 7 years, and whatever it was that might have grown in that space if things had been different. June came in hot and golden, and the kitchen garden came up in vigorous rows, and Theodora learned the rhythms of the split rock the way you learn any place you begin to love, one detail at a time. She learned that Nathan took his coffee with nothing in it, and that he read for an hour before sleeping, and that he had a habit of standing in the east-facing doorway in the early morning watching the light come over the ridge with the same expression she sometimes had at the window. She learned that he was harder on himself than on anyone else, and that he laughed rarely but genuinely when he did, and that the sound of it, low and real, was worth more than the frequent and easy laughs of men who deployed them for effect. She also learned, and tried not to dwell on, that he had a way of looking at her that was not simply the careful inventory of a man assessing his employee's work. It was something else, something that had edges she did not know how to approach. The moment that changed things came in the middle of June, on a Thursday, which perhaps should have been a Tuesday to be poetic but was not. There was a man named Garrett Cole who ran a neighboring spread about 12 miles west. He was not a bad man exactly, but he was a man who felt that his proximity to Nathan's land gave him a right to opinions about it, and he had been making overtures since Theodora arrived about buying the east pasture, which Nathan had consistently declined to sell. Cole came by on that Thursday afternoon with 2 of his men, and Nathan was not at the house, and Cole was the kind of man who adjusted his behavior depending on whether there was another man present. He was not threatening. He was worse than threatening. He was dismissive in the way of a man who has decided that a woman alone is not a real obstacle, only a placeholder for the real conversation he planned to have with the man who owned the place. He stood in the yard and talked past her at the house, asking if Nathan was in, and when she said that Nathan was at the south fence and she would be happy to carry a message, Cole looked at her with a measuring expression that she had seen on men's faces many times. "What exactly are you to Bailey?" he asked. "I manage his household," she said. Cole smiled in a way that she was familiar with, the smile that implied additional meanings she had not consented to. "Nice arrangement," he said. She looked at him steadily and said, "If you would like to leave a message for Mr. Bailey, I am glad to take it. If you would like to wait on the porch, I can offer you water. If you would like to ride on, I can tell him you called. Those are the options." He looked at her for a moment longer and then he looked away, because men like Cole always looked away eventually when they found something solid instead of something that would give. "Tell him I came by about the east pasture," he said. "Tell him I'll be back when he's home." "I will tell him," she said. He and his men rode away, and she went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the work table, breathing steadily. Nathan came in an hour later, and she told him about Cole's visit simply and directly, relaying the exchange without embellishment. He listened with growing stillness. "Did he speak to you badly?" he asked. "He spoke to me dismissively," she said, "which is different. I've had worse." "That doesn't make it acceptable," he said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I should have been here." "You cannot be everywhere," she said practically. "And I handled it." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "You did." He paused. "He won't get the east pasture. He knows that. He just likes to press." "Then he will press again," she said. "Probably," he said. "And I'll deal with it when he does." Cole did come back the following Saturday, and Nathan was there. And she watched from the window as Nathan walked out to the yard and spoke to Cole briefly and without visible heat. And Cole looked at her briefly through the window and then back at Nathan. And then he rode away without pressing further. And she did not know exactly what Nathan had said, but she could read the result of it. Nathan came inside and poured himself a cup of coffee and said nothing about it, and after a moment she said, "Thank you." He glanced at her over his coffee cup. "For what?" "Whatever you said." He set the cup down and looked at her directly. "I told him that the people on my property are my people, and I will not have them treated as though they are less than. That applies to Coop and Pete and the Harlan brothers, and it applies to you." He paused. "He won't be back." "My people." She stood in the kitchen and felt something move through her that she was entirely unprepared for, a warmth so thorough it was almost frightening, and she turned back to the stove because the biscuits needed to come out, and she focused on that, on the immediate and the practical, because the other thing was too large to look at directly. He chose her. She did not know what to do with that. She turned it over in her mind for days, not the incident but the words, "my people." The way he had said it without hesitation or qualification, placing her in his protection with the same matter-of-fact certainty he gave to the men who had worked for him for years. She who had been overlooked by choir directors and suitors and employers and entire towns. She who had learned to expect invisibility the way you learn to expect summer heat, as simply the condition of being alive. She did not know what to do with being included, with being chosen. She wrote to Rosa Alvarez. Not about Nathan, not directly, but the letter curved in that direction without her quite meaning it to. And Rosa Alvarez, who was a perceptive and experienced woman, wrote back a letter that said several things about kitchen organization, and then, in the final paragraph, said simply, "That man has not looked at a woman since Maria died. If he is looking now, it is because she is worth looking at. Do not be afraid of being wanted, Theodora. You have been worth wanting for longer than anyone has taken the time to tell you." She read that paragraph 4 times and then folded the letter and put it in the small box where she kept her few important papers. Summer deepened. The days were long and hot and full of work, and the work had its own satisfaction, the kitchen garden producing abundantly, the house running with quiet efficiency, the meals timed to the rhythm of the ranch work in ways that made everyone's days easier. She found that she was happy in a way she could not have described to anyone in Calla Creek, because it was not a loud happiness but a deep and working one, rooted in being useful and present and somewhere that felt like it had her shape. Nathan came in one evening in late June, later than usual, and she had kept his supper warm and he sat at the kitchen table and ate it, and they talked for longer than they usually did, about a letter he had received from a cattle broker in San Antonio, and about the likelihood of rain, and about a book she had found on his shelves and read without asking, a habit she confessed with slight embarrassment. "Which one?" he asked. "The Dana," she said. 2 years before the mast. He looked at her with that expression she had learned to recognize, the quiet, pleased surprise he did not quite suppress. "What did you think of it?" "I thought it made me wish I had seen the Pacific Ocean," she said. "And I thought the men who built California by hand and were paid almost nothing for it deserved better." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "they did." "You can borrow it when you're finished," she said. "I've read it 3 times," he said. "It's why I bought it," she smiled. She did not often let herself smile fully, because she was not a woman who had had many reasons to, but something about his expression made her let it happen, and it happened slowly and completely, the way things do when they are real. He looked at her smile with an expression she could not read, except that there was something in it that made the back of her neck warm. She looked away. "I'll read it again if you want to discuss it," he said after a moment, and his voice was slightly different, slightly careful, the way a voice is when a person is being precise about something that matters. "I would like that," she said. They did not discuss it for another 2 weeks because life intervened in the practical ways that life on a working ranch intervenes. But when they did, sitting on the porch in the evening with the last of the daylight going out over the cedar, it was one of the better conversations she had ever had with anyone. He had opinions that were not what she expected, and she had arguments she had not fully articulated before. And they disagreed about several things with the vigorous pleasure of 2 people who are well matched enough to argue without either of them needing to win. Coop rode past the porch at one point, looked at them, and then looked at the sky with the expression of a man making very determined small talk with the universe. July brought a crisis in the form of a fever that swept through the bunkhouse, laying low Pete Garza first and then both the Harlan brothers in quick succession, with Coop nursing a bad version of it himself and managing to stay on his feet through Will alone. Nathan and Theodora ran the whole operation between them for 2 weeks, which meant Nathan managing outside and Theodora managing inside, and both of them managing the sick men, who were miserable and grateful, and not always coherent about either. She barely slept. She learned the contents of Nathan's medicine cabinet, and wrote 3 letters to the doctor in Careville, and boiled broth and changed compresses, and kept the fever from climbing to dangerous levels through vigilance and luck, and the particular fierce competence she brought to anything she had decided she was going to do. Nathan came in and out with supplies and checked on the men and checked on her, and there were nights when they crossed paths in the narrow hallway between the sick men's room and the kitchen, and their exhaustion stripped away the careful formal distance they usually kept. Once at 2 in the morning she came out of Pete Garza's room to find Nathan leaning against the wall in the hallway, his eyes closed, and she stopped, thinking he was asleep, and he opened his eyes and they stood close in the narrow space for a moment. "He's better," she said quietly. "The fever broke." "Good," he said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You need to sleep." "So do you," she said. "I'll sleep when it's light," he said. "That is not how sleeping works," she said. "Theodora," he said, and the way he said her name, low and tired, and something else she was not ready to name, made her breath catch. "Get some sleep. I've got watch." She went. But she lay awake for a while afterward, thinking about the way her name sounded in his voice. All 4 men recovered fully by the end of July, and when Pete Garza was well enough to sit up and eat, he declared with great sincerity that Miss Hadley's broth had literal curative properties, and that he owed her a considerable debt, which made Harlan laugh from his bunk and Dutch say that he was exaggerating, but only slightly. The gratitude of the men was real and warm, and she accepted it in the particular way she was learning to accept things that were given to her without expectation, which was still not easily, but more gracefully than before. Nathan said nothing about the 2 weeks directly, but one afternoon he came in from the barn with a bunch of wildflowers that were growing along the fence line, Indian paintbrush and black-eyed Susans and something small and yellow she did not know the name of, and he set them on the kitchen table and said, "These grow by the south fence. I thought you might like them." She stood and looked at the flowers for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "You've done good work here," he said. He was standing in the kitchen door, hat in hand, and he looked at her with that direct, careful attention. "Not just these past weeks, all of it. The house is better than it has been in years. The men are well fed and less fractious. The garden is something." She pressed her lips together because she was afraid of what her face might do if she did not. "I am just doing my job," she said. "It's more than that," he said quietly, "and I think you know it." She did not look away. She was learning slowly not to look away. "I know it," she said. Something shifted between them. She felt it the way you feel weather coming before it arrives, a change in pressure, a different quality of air. He did not move forward, and she did not move toward him, and after a moment he put his hat on and went back out, and she sat down at the table near the wildflowers and thought that she was in considerable trouble, and that it was the best trouble she had ever been in. August arrived and brought with it a man named Silas Webb, who was not from anywhere near Calla Creek and was not anyone's neighbor. He was a land speculator from Austin, and he arrived with a survey map and a very confident manner, and an offer for the split rock that was higher than the land's market value, which Nathan recognized immediately as the price of a man who needs the specific land rather than land in general. Nathan had water. Not a great river, but a steady limestone spring that fed a year-round creek through the south pasture, and in a region that was growing drier by the year and increasingly crowded with cattle operations. A reliable water source was the kind of thing that made a man's land worth more than its acres. Webb sat on the porch and smiled and made his offer, and Nathan listened to all of it with the patient attention he gave everything, and then he declined politely and finally. Webb accepted this with good grace in person, and with less grace at a distance. A week later, Pete Garza came to the house in the morning with word that the south fence had been cut in 3 places overnight, and 8 head of cattle had drifted through. The damage was annoying but contained, and they repaired it and found the cattle and brought them back. And Nathan did not say it was Webb, and also did not say it wasn't. 2 weeks after that, the creek ran low for 3 days in a way that was not natural, and Nathan rode upstream and found that someone had dammed it above the property line with a crude, temporary structure of stones and branches that he and Coop dismantled in an afternoon. "He's testing what I'll tolerate," Nathan said that evening, sitting at the kitchen table, and Theodora set his coffee in front of him and sat across from him. "What will you do?" she asked. "I am going to go to Austin," he said. "The land title and water rights are registered with the county. I want copies, and I want them reviewed by a lawyer, and I want Webb to know I have them." He looked at her. "I'll be gone 4 days. Coop can run things." "We'll manage," she said. "I know you will," he said. He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. "Is there anything you need from Austin?" She thought about it. "Paper," she said. "Good paper. And ink, the kind that doesn't bleed through." He nodded as though this was a perfectly reasonable request, which it was, and she noticed that he wrote it down in the small notebook he kept in his vest pocket, alongside the legal references and the county office addresses. He rode out the next morning, and she watched him go from the porch with her coffee, and the morning felt different after his horse rounded the cedar grove and the sound of hooves faded, and she went inside and got on with the day because that was what you did. He was back in 3.5 days, which was less than 4, and he came directly to the house, and she was in the kitchen starting supper, and he came in through the back door and set a wrapped package on the table. "The paper," he said, "and the ink and a few other things." She unwrapped it. The paper was good quality as requested. The ink was the kind that did not bleed. There was also a small book of poetry by Walt Whitman, which she had mentioned once briefly in the context of something else entirely, and which she had not expected him to remember. She looked at the book. She looked at him. "You remembered," she said. "You mentioned it in passing," he said carefully. She held the book. It was a small, solid thing. She thought about all the years of being not quite seen, of being present and unremarked upon, and she thought about a man writing down paper and ink in a notebook and then adding a book of poetry because he had been listening closely enough to catch a single passing mention. "Nathan," she said. He was very still. "I do not know how to accept things gracefully," she said. "I've had so little practice at it. When people give me things or choose me for things, I keep waiting for the moment when it turns out to be a mistake, when they meant someone else, when I misunderstood." He looked at her steadily. He did not fill the silence with reassurances. He let her speak. "I did not place that advertisement," she said. "I came because Elias did, and because my options were limited, and because the road looked like something worth following. But I am glad I came. I want you to know that." She paused. "I am very glad." He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes and the slight tension in his jaw that meant he was keeping himself carefully composed. "I did not know who would answer that advertisement," he said. "I did not know it would be you. I did not know what you would be." He paused. "But I knew the first time you looked at me in that general store, the first 5 minutes, that you were someone I wanted to know, and every day since then has confirmed it." He paused again. "I am not easy to be with. I told you that at the beginning, and it remains true, but I am trying to be honest with you because you deserve honesty." "You are the most honest person I have ever met," she said. "Then I would like to know," he said, "if you would be willing to consider something beyond employment." She looked at him. The kitchen was warm. The evening light was coming through the window. The wildflowers she had put in a jar when he first brought them had been replaced twice since then, because she had gone and found more herself, and she had not examined that habit closely until now. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing to consider it." What followed was not the immediate dramatic resolution of a story that has been building to a kiss. What followed was better than that, which is to say it was real. He took her hand, which was a small gesture and also not a small gesture at all, and they stood in the kitchen with the evening coming in, and he held her hand like it was something he intended to be careful with. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I wasn't ready sooner," she said honestly, "and neither were you." He looked at her hand in his and then at her. "Probably not," he admitted. "We are both," she said, "very careful people." "Yes," he said, "we are." She was smiling again, the full real kind, and he looked at her smile with the expression she had catalogued but not yet named, and she named it now. Longing, gone tender at the edges into something that had already become love. He was careful with her. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not cautious in the way of a man who does not trust, but careful in the way of a man who understands value. He courted her in the plain and unhurried way of a man who means what he does, not with dramatic gestures but with attention and honesty, and the consistent daily practice of treating her like someone who mattered. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons, which were the slowest part of the ranch week, to different parts of the Split Rock, and he showed her the spring that fed the South Creek and the outcropping of limestone on the North Ridge, where the view opened up over 20 miles of hill country, and the place along the east fence where wild plum grew every August, and his wife, he told her quietly, had made preserves from it every year. She listened when he talked about Maria. She did not find it threatening. The dead cannot be rivals, and the love a man had for a woman who died young only told her who he was capable of being. She thought Maria had been loved well and that Nathan had carried that loss with the same integrity he carried everything. "Do you think she would have minded," she asked once, looking out over the hill country from the limestone ridge, "that you were considering this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Maria wanted me to be happy," he said. "She made me promise it, which at the time I thought was very unfair of her." He paused. "I think she would have liked you. She would have appreciated that you do not tolerate foolishness." "She sounds very sensible," Theodora said. "She was," he said, and then he smiled, the full and real version, which she was learning was rare enough to be significant. "You both are." September came in with a break in the heat and the smell of change, and the hill country turned amber and gold at the edges, and the morning air had the first cold in it that made the coffee taste better. The plums along the east fence came ripe, and Theodora picked them and made 4 jars of preserves, following the directions Rosa Alvarez had sent in one of her letters. And when she set them on the shelf, they caught the light in a way that was simply beautiful. Nathan came to her one evening in early September on the porch, when the stars were coming out thick and the air was still and the whole world smelled of cedar and cooling stone, and he sat in the chair beside her rather than the chair across from her, which was itself a statement. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "I want to ask if you would marry me," he said. "I want to ask it straightforwardly because I think you deserve straightforward, and because I have thought about it for long enough that I know it is what I want." He paused. "I know this is not a conventional situation. I know I am asking for something significant. I know I am not easy, and that marriage to me will not be easy either, and I will not pretend otherwise." He looked at her. "But I think we suit each other in a way that I did not believe was possible for me again. And I think you have been placed somewhere where nobody saw you clearly, and I want to spend whatever time we have making that a different story." She was quiet for a long time. The stars were very bright. A coyote called somewhere far to the south. She had been not chosen for so many things. She had learned to hold her wants at a careful distance, the way you learn to breathe shallowly in a smoke-filled room. She had told herself she was practical, she was realistic, she was fine. She was not fine. She had not been fine. She had been surviving, which is a different thing entirely. She thought about 31 years of background and the road leaving Calla Creek, and the first morning she had seen the hill country light and the wildflowers on the kitchen table, and the Book of Whitman and the way her name sounded in his voice. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the night air together and did not feel the need to fill it with anything more, because some moments are complete as they are. Coop's reaction, when Nathan told the men at breakfast the following morning, was to set down his coffee cup and look at Theodora with an expression of sincere satisfaction and say, "I knew it. with such conviction that Pete Garza demanded to know why he had not told them. "Because it was not my business to tell," Coop said, which was so unlike Coop's usual character that everyone laughed, including Theodora. Dutch reached across the table and shook Nathan's hand with the formality of a man who feels things deeply and expresses them in handshakes, and Harlan said, "Miss Hadley, you've made the best biscuits in the hill country and you've given us our boss back, and both of those things matter tremendously," which was not the most romantic compliment she had ever received, but was among the most sincere. She wrote to Rosa Alvarez, and Rosa's response came back by return post, a letter that was 3 pages long and contained, at the center of it, the words "I knew this too, and I am so very glad for both of you," and practical instructions about the plum preserves and a recipe for the wedding cake she intended to send by post, and several observations about Nathan Bailey that were warm and well-founded and made Theodora cry in the good way, the way you cry when something fits into place. She wrote to Elias Drummond in Dallas. His response was short because Elias was not a man of many words, but it said, "I am glad I wrote that letter and even gladder you did not refuse to go. You have been chosen for more than you ever knew. Congratulations, Theodora." She read that letter on the porch in the morning light and let herself cry again briefly, and then went in and got on with the day. They were married in October, at the church in Careville, which was small and plain and well lit by the October sun through its clear windows. She wore her good blue dress, which was not a wedding dress but was decent and clean and the color suited her, and Nathan wore his good coat, which she had never seen him in before. He looked different in it, not uncomfortable, but as though the coat was something he had not worn in a long time and was reacquainting himself with. The minister was a brisk and kindly man named Reverend Greer, who seemed genuinely pleased to be officiating, as though weddings in October were a particular gift. Coop stood as witness, and Pete Garza had combed his hair to an unprecedented degree. Dutch and Harlan sat in the pew behind them, shoulder to shoulder, and Dutch was red about the ears in the way of a man suppressing feeling. When Reverend Greer said the words and Nathan turned to her and said, in that low, careful voice, "I do," she felt it all the way through, the way you feel a stone dropping into deep water, the ripple going out to every edge. She said her own words clearly and steadily, the way she did everything, and when Nathan took her hand at the end, it was the same gesture as the kitchen in August, careful and certain, and also completely different, the way everything is different when it is made permanent. They had a modest wedding supper at the hotel, the 6 of them, and Coop gave a toast that was surprisingly eloquent for a man who appeared, on the surface, to operate primarily on humor and stubbornness, and Pete Garza cried briefly and then denied it, and Nathan and Theodora came home to the split rock in the moonlight with the hill country silver around them and the stars overhead and the night smelling of cedar and cooling stone, and everything was theirs. The winter of 1883 going into 1884 was mild and good. The ranch was healthy, the cattle fat, the water running clear in the South Creek. Nathan settled the issue of Sela's Web conclusively in November, the water rights registered and legally fortified, the county record in the Kerr County Courthouse as solid as limestone, and Webb moved on to other opportunities with no further incident. She learned things in the winter that you can only learn close to someone over time, in the shared days of a life together. She learned that Nathan had nightmares sometimes, and that he did not want to talk about them but also did not want to be left alone in them. And so she learned to be present without making it a scene. She learned that he was tender with animals in a way he was careful about showing, and that he could be impatient with himself about things that no one else would consider failing. She learned that he read widely and thought carefully, and that the conversations they had in the evenings, by the fire with the winter outside, were the best conversations of her life. He learned things about her too. He learned that she had been afraid for so long of being seen that being seen still frightened her, even when she wanted it. He learned that she was fiercer than she looked, and that her quietness was not passivity but precision, that she was choosing when to speak and what to spend herself on. He learned that she laughed in a way she seemed to be surprised by each time, as though joy still caught her off guard, and he made it a private, persistent project to surprise her with it as often as he could. Spring came back, and with it a letter from Rosa Alvarez that she read twice before she told Nathan, because she wanted to be certain, and then she told him on a Tuesday morning, which was the day they had met, and she thought that was fitting. "I am going to have a child," she said. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he set it down and looked at her with an expression that undid something in her chest completely, something that had been braced and held for 31 years. He came around the table and took her face in his hands, which he had not done before, and he looked at her with everything visible, all the grief and the years and the care and the love. And he said, "Theodora," just her name, the way that was already its own whole language. "Are you glad?" She asked because she still sometimes needed to ask. "I am," he said, "more glad than I know how to say." She covered his hands with hers. "Then say it any way you like," she said. "I have time to listen." He said it with words and with the way he stayed close the rest of that morning, and with the care he took of her in the months that followed, the same attentive, quiet, certain care he gave everything he valued. The child was born in December of 1884, a boy, delivered by the careful doctor who drove out in the cold and arrived with an hour to spare. The labor was hard and long, and Nathan stayed outside the room because those were the conventions of the time, but she could hear him pacing in the hall, which she found both endearing and faintly exasperating. And when it was done, and the doctor opened the door, Nathan was in the room before anyone invited him. She was exhausted, and the baby was red and furious and entirely new, and Nathan looked at his son with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a complete and unguarded wonder, and then he looked at her, and she understood that this was the other side of his love, the part that had been waiting for something future, for something that was not grief. "He looks like a judge," Coop said when introduced later. "Very stern and important." "He is 2 hours old," Nathan said. "He knows what he thinks," Coop said. "I can tell." They named him Thomas James Bailey. Thomas for no particular reason except that it suited him. James for Nathan's father, who had died when Nathan was 19, and who he had spoken of with the particular respect of a son who learned something important from his father. Thomas Bailey was, from the very beginning, a person with opinions. He was loud about them, and he was convinced of them, and he did not particularly accept being told otherwise, which Theodora recognized with a very specific private amusement as a trait he had sourced from both of his parents in equal measure. The years moved the way good years do, with weight and richness, not quickly. She and Nathan moved through them the way two people do when they have found the particular rhythm of living together that feels, not effortless exactly, but right, the kind of right that you earn through choosing each other on ordinary days, not just the significant ones. She ran the household and the kitchen garden and the accounts, and as the ranch grew, she took on more of the business ledgers, because she had a head for numbers and he trusted her with it completely. She became known in Careville as a woman of considerable competence, which she received with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had known her own worth for longer than anyone had been paying attention to it. He ran the ranch and built it steadily and thoughtfully, adding acreage when it was right, improving the herd, keeping the water protected and the land well. He remained not easy, precisely as advertised, with his particular standards and his careful directness and his expectations of himself that exceeded his expectations of anyone else. But she had learned the geography of his difficultness, and she understood that it came from a deep place of integrity. And on the days when he was hard on himself or impatient with something that was not going as it should, she knew how to be present in ways that helped. She was not without her own difficultness, which he would have been the first to confirm. She still braced sometimes against being seen. She still sometimes retreated into efficiency when the emotional weight of something was more than she was ready to carry. She still occasionally defaulted to silence when she should have spoken. He learned those patterns and met them with the patient, steady presence that was his particular gift. And on the days when she pulled back from something she needed, he was simply there, not pressing, not withdrawing, just there. They argued and argued well, without either of them needing to win, and made up without drama, because neither of them went in for drama, and went to sleep on the same side of every night. Thomas was 3 when they received a visit from a woman who introduced herself as Elena Webb, the daughter of Silas Webb, who had died in Austin the previous year. She came alone on a good horse with a letter from her father's lawyer, and she was not what either of them expected. She was 26 and straightforward and apologetic in a way that was clearly genuine and not comfortable for her. "My father was wrong," she said, "about the water and about the way he handled this property. I have no claim here and I am not making one. I came because he left a letter asking me to come and say so in person, and I think he spent his last years regretting how he operated." She paused. "I wanted you to know it was said." Nathan received this with the direct quiet of a man who knows how to hold something that is offered. "Tell his lawyer the matter is settled," he said. "I appreciate the honesty." Elena Webb shook their hands and rode away, and Theodora watched her go with the particular thought that honesty running in a family was rare and worth appreciating wherever it appeared, and that some things did get resolved even when you had stopped expecting them to. Elias Drummond died in the fall of 1887 in Dallas, his son's house, in a soft chair with his knees warm, which was exactly what he had wanted. The letter came from his son with a note that said Elias had spoken of her often and proudly, and that he wanted her to know he had never doubted his decision to write that letter. She sat with that letter for a long time, and then she put it in the box with Rosa's letters and her other important papers, and she went out to the kitchen garden and stood in the October light for a while thinking about old men who do foolish, well-meaning things and change lives they had no business changing. "Thank you," she thought, and meant it down to the root. Rosa Alvarez visited in the spring of 1888, traveling up from her daughter's home in Mexico, and it was one of the better weeks Theodora could remember. Rosa was a small, fierce woman of 60 who had opinions about everything and was entirely right about most of them. And she and Theodora fit together the way women do when they have been corresponding for years and have already done all the necessary introductions in writing. Rosa held Thomas, who was 3½ and deeply suspicious of strangers, and told him in a mixture of Spanish and English that he had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth, and that this was a very good combination. And Thomas considered this and apparently found it acceptable. She taught Theodora 3 recipes she had never sent in letters, because some things, she said, needed demonstration, and she spent an afternoon in the kitchen garden with her hands in the dirt pointing at the tomato plants and explaining something about the soil that Theodora wrote down carefully. On the last evening, sitting on the porch with the light going out over the hill country, Rosa looked at Nathan and at Theodora and at Thomas asleep in Theodora's lap, and she said in a satisfied voice, "This is good, this is exactly right." Nathan, who had been reading and listening with one ear, looked up. "You always knew it would be?" he asked with the slight dry tone he used when he was amused. "I hoped," Rosa said. "There is a difference. I hoped very hard." She smiled. "It is enough." In the late summer of 1889, Theodora was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, the fall mild and clear, and she walked the kitchen garden in the mornings and rode out in the wagon with Nathan on Sunday afternoons until it became impractical, and felt the hill country changing around her in the familiar way of a place that had learned her shape and she had learned its. The second child was a girl, born on a February morning with the sun coming over the East Ridge, and she was small and immediate and decided about everything from the first moment, in the way of people who know their own minds. They named her Clara Rose, Clara because Theodora had always loved the sound of it, Rose for Rosa Alvarez, who received the news by letter and wrote back a reply so warm it practically generated its own heat. Thomas, 4 years old and very serious about it, regarded his sister for a long time and then announced that she was small but seemed capable, which was as high a compliment as Thomas bestowed on anything, and which made both his parents suppress laughter with considerable effort. Nathan held Clara with the same unguarded wonder he had held Thomas with, and she felt again the particular fullness of watching a man who carries grief discover that his life still has room for new things. The split rock grew and was good. The water ran clear. The cattle were healthy. The kitchen garden produced every summer in long, abundant rows. The preserves lined the shelves in amber and red rows, and the plums along the east fence gave up their fruit every August without fail. Coop married in 1890. A woman from Careville named Abigail who was quietly funny and made excellent pie, and came to the Split Rock for Sunday suppers, until it became clear that those suppers were a fixture rather than an occasion. Pete Garza eventually returned to San Antonio to work with his father's business, and they received letters from him on birthdays and holidays, and he visited once with a young woman he introduced as his intended, and Theodora fed them a supper that Pete declared, with the superlative confidence of nostalgia, to be the finest meal he had eaten since the last time he ate at her table. Harlan and Dutch stayed, as they had stayed from the beginning, rooted by something quiet and persistent that she recognized as loyalty of the deepest kind, the kind you do not talk about but simply live. Nathan came to her one evening in the fall of 1891, when the hill country was gold and cool and the children were in bed, and they were sitting together in the room they had made their own over 8 years of living in it, and he said, unprompted, in the way he occasionally said things when they had been composting in him long enough to need saying, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him over the book she was reading. "I want to tell you that the night I drove to San Antonio to meet whoever had answered that advertisement, I was not expecting anything particular," he said. "I had managed 8 years without expecting much of anything from the parts of life that are not work. I had gotten good at it." He paused. "When I walked into that store and you said your name and looked at me the way you did, that first 5 minutes I told you about, I thought, there she is. I did not know what that meant exactly, but I thought it." She set down her book. "I did not think anything so clear," she said honestly. "I thought you were a man who had the wrong woman and I waited for you to realize it." He looked at her. "Did you stop waiting?" She thought about it. "Somewhere around the wildflowers," she said. "I stopped waiting and started hoping, which is not the same thing but is much better." He reached across and took her hand, which was still, after 8 years, a gesture she had not grown so accustomed to that it stopped meaning something. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she said. "For coming," he said. "For the road looking like something worth following." She looked at their hands. Outside the window, the hill country was dark and still and very old, and the stars were thick over the limestone ridge, and somewhere in the house Thomas was probably reading by a smuggled candle, which she would address in the morning, and Clara was sleeping in the determined way of a child who decided even sleeping would be done correctly. She thought about Calla Creek and the rented room and the clock ticking, and the man in the doorway on a Tuesday morning in 1883 who had asked for her by name. She thought about being not chosen, for the choir, for the job, for the boy at 18, for everything. She thought about standing in that general store and expecting him to realize his mistake, and she thought about the moment she understood that there was no mistake, that he had looked for her and found her and was still looking. She had not been chosen for anything in her whole life. He had chosen her on a Tuesday, and she had not known what to do with that. She knew now. She had learned, slowly and honestly, and without pretending it was simpler than it was, what you did when someone chose you. You chose them back. You chose them on the ordinary days and the hard ones and the days that were neither, when life was simply the kitchen and the garden and the children, and the long evenings on the porch with the hill country spread out around you like something you had been given the right to inhabit. You chose them with your whole self, the careful parts and the afraid parts and the parts that still sometimes braced for being overlooked, and you let yourself be chosen in return, which was the harder half of the work and the more important one. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "I want you to know that I would choose this again," she said. "Every part of it. I would follow that road again. I would walk into that uncertainty again. I would choose this house and this land and these people and this life." She paused. "I would choose you." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something was true enough to require that kind of space. "I would choose you first," he said. Every time. She believed him. She had learned, slowly and with difficulty and with great reward, to believe him. And that, she thought, was the completion of something that had started with a Tuesday and a man in a doorway asking for her by name. The fire was warm. The children were sleeping. The stars were thick over the limestone ridge. Outside the window, the split rock lay quiet in the dark, hers and his and theirs, rooted into the hill country like something that had been there a long time and intended to be there longer. She picked up her book. He picked up his. The clock on the shelf ticked the way it had always ticked, steadily and without drama, marking all the ordinary minutes that made up a life. She was home. She had never in 31 years been home before. She was home now. And it was, she thought, with the full and certain and unhurried happiness of a woman who had waited long enough to know the real thing when it came, more than enough. It was everything.